Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. We're on day 103 of the war, and we are continuing on with that war in all of the different areas. In the Gaza Strip, the IDF forces are continuing on with their operations, really consolidating the hold of the northern Gaza, of the northern area of Gaza, and also extending those operations into Khan Yunis, deeper and deeper into Khan Yunis every day, into Deir el-Balach, and into Nusirat, all of that central area of the Gaza Strip, and then also working down towards the southern area of the Gaza Strip to Rafah, which is really where we understand that's when most of the population is concentrated there, and much of the Hamas infrastructure is also spread between Rafah on the one hand and Khan Yunis on the other, and that's where the operations are continuing on, really hand-to-hand combat. Still, Hamas managing to fire rockets at Israel and mortar shells at the forces operating there, and trying really their best to push off that war. In the north, we're continuing on with that war as well. There's another war going on with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, another one of the Iranian tentacles that are operating there. They've been continuing to fire rockets yesterday into the northern Galilee, and Israel responding this morning as well. More attacks and more Israeli responses. Really what we have there is pretty much an all-out war, but it's just not declared as such, at least for the meantime. The ideas of trying to come to some type of negotiated settlement there based on the American idea of now implementing Resolution 1701, that same resolution that brought about the end of the Second Lebanon War in 2006, and which was never implemented by Hezbollah at any stage until now. For some reason, it appears to be the idea that that can now be implemented, and that Hezbollah, this terrorist organization, will in some way adhere to the requirements of that resolution. From the south, from the Houthis, we're also seeing the continuation of the interference with the freedom of navigation. More ships being attacked today, and a Marshall Island ship being attacked earlier on this afternoon, and American and other coalition forces responding to that event. And then this morning, or this afternoon really, in Israel, we saw a rocket being shot down, or a missile being shot down, that had been fired towards Israel south, towards Eilat, and the alarm sirens going off there only because of the firing of the defensive rockets, and not because there was necessarily any direct danger to Eilat itself. That's what we've seen there in Judea and Samaria. We've seen the continuation of the anti-terrorism operations there, focusing not only on Hamas, the PFLP, and the other terrorist organizations like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also focusing on the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade. This is the organization headed by Fatah, headed by Mahmoud Abbas, this same guy who now heads the Palestinian Authority. It's his terrorists who are now operating against Israel as well, including members of the Palestinian Authority security forces, these same people who have been trained by US and international forces. They're the ones who are meant to be fighting terrorism, but rather instead they are the ones who are leading the terrorism. We saw yesterday Abdullah Abu Shalal, one of these terrorists, being neutralized as he was working on a substantial attack against Israeli targets. In Israel, thankfully, we've seen no more terrorist attacks today, but we are discussing a really very wide subject this evening. Is expected to be discussed in the Israeli cabinet, the question of what to do with the tax money that Israel collects and passes over to the Palestinian Authority. This is tens of millions of shekels, billions of dollars every year. If we remember, the Palestinian Authority receives that money as part of the Oslo Accords. It isn't given that money as a gift. It was meant to use that money in order to implement the peace of the Oslo Accords that was intended by the Oslo Accords. It has never done so. Instead, it uses that money to reward terrorists, to incentivize terrorism, to fund its anti-Israel activities around the world, and to fund its incitement against Israel, against Israelis, throughout its school system. We now know that the Palestinian Authority has recognized thousands of the terrorists who have been arrested since October 7th as terrorists who are entitled to receive payments from the Palestinian Authority as a reward for their acts of terrorism. This includes also members of Hamas's Nukhba force, those same terrorists who infiltrated Israel and murdered, butchered, tortured, raped, pillaged. They are now going to be receiving a payment from the Palestinian Authority as a reward for their acts of terrorism. So tonight, Israel's governments will be discussing the subject of the continued transfer of that money. Israel agreed nonetheless at the beginning of November to transfer some of that money to the Palestinian Authority at the behest of the US administration, but to withhold the money that the PA used to pay to Gaza. They're no longer responsible for Gaza. They have nothing more to do with Gaza. So why should they be receiving that money at all? That was the decision that was made at the time. The US, Mahmoud Abbas, decided that he would behave like a spoiled child in a supermarket and say, well, if you're not going to give me all of the money so I can pay all of the rewards to all of the terrorists, then I'm not going to take any of it. And he returned 402 million shekel, over 100 million shekel already at the beginning of November. All this money is waiting for him. All he has to do is say, I want the money, and he can take it. And instead of pressuring Mahmoud Abbas to take that money and to use it for better things, the US administration is trying to broker a deal where that money that's being withheld will be transferred to a third party, and then Mahmoud Abbas will agree to take the funds. So really, he doesn't really need that money. He just wants to ensure that his form of terrorism is imposed on Israel and Israel's government by the US, because he's not going to see that money anyway. So what exactly is the point of transferring that money to a third party? That's part of terrorism. That's the way that terrorism works. You force the other side to do something which they didn't want to do, using violence as its means. And really, that brings us on to the subject that we're going to discuss a little bit more today with my friend and guest and JCPA fellow, Dr. Mansdorf. Terrorism, how it works, specifically in our case and in our circumstance. We're talking about 139 hostages that Hamas is still holding in Gaza. We've seen not a small of the hostages who were taken on the first day of that attack on the 7th of October being released, but it's still we're left with 139 people in Gaza. Among them today, little Kfir Bibas, who was taken when he was 9 months old, is celebrating his first birthday in captivity. He's there with his brother Ariel, who was just 4 when he was kidnapped, and with his parents Shiri and Yarden, who were taken all together. The terrorists continue to hold the Bibas family and many others. We have the son of our friends John and Rachel Goldberg Polin Hirsch, who was taken by the terrorists whilst injured and is now been in captivity for 103 days. All of these families are suffering really a fate that I cannot even start to contemplate. And Hamas is using that to their advantage, Owen. They're using all types of psychological warfare. They've been releasing videos of the hostages crying out for help.
Alive one day, dead the
alive
next.
One way, dead the next, claiming that Israel in its strike has killed dozens of the hostages. How do we understand that? How do we even contemplate responding to that? Predominantly to our families inside. And if you remember, we had this conversation almost, I think, the second day of the War Room briefing. We already saw this coming, that this is what Hamas is going to do, to use and abuse really the hostages in order to forward their goals. And that's exactly what they're doing.
They're also abusing the families. As you mentioned before, it's very hard to imagine what a family is going through in terms of that. But it's 103 days. So a family that at the beginning may have had a stiff upper lip, and in putting through it, the erosion of their emotional ability to cope just goes day after day after day. And on a theoretical basis, we would like to say ignore those videos, don't take a look at it and keep on going. They get the information, and it's exactly what Hamas planned, and it's exactly what is happening. So everything that you said is right on target. And unfortunately, the people that are suffering more than anyone else are the families. And that's intentional, by the way.
That's
Hamas
part of the terrorism.
Intentional to do that, because in turn, what the families do is then transfer their efforts to people who they think are able to help out. So they're frustrated. They then move to who they think they could help out. And here is the dilemma that we have in terms of Israeli leadership, because the goals of the war has been set as destroying Hamas and freeing the hostages. And up until now, it's been generally accepted that both those goals can exist side by side. And we're starting to ask the question now, as a society, is it possible to have both those goals achieved at the same time? And that's the dilemma that the leadership is in. And that's the dilemma that Hamas is using to manipulate the families toward their one goal. And their one goal is, well, we talked about this the first time, the release of the prisoners is gravy for them. That's not really something major. Their one goal is to survive this horrific attack and come out as heroes.
And to live to tell about it.
Right. And they will tell about it. And this is already, and we've seen the data coming from the Palestinian polling that's been done, that this is something that's looked up to. People in the Palestinian authorities are proud of this, and they continue to be proud of this. We see people overseas in marches, that pro-Palestinian marches. It is something that they glorify. So if Hamas succeeds just to survive, that's all they need to live to another day, because they have patience in terms of long-term goals. The question really for us is, in terms of the hostage families, in terms of the strategy, the war strategy of Israel, is Hamas affecting it at all through their psychological techniques? Is the goal of destroying Hamas still intact? Is the goal of releasing the hostages still intact as a co-goal? Because we're already hearing voices that are saying it can't be both. It's one or the other. And that's the dilemma.
That's right, because what Hamas is demanding as part of that idea of releasing the hostages, Hamas is going for broke. Their demand is that Israel stop the war, withdraw from Gaza, release all of the terrorists that are in Israel's jails, and only then will they release the hostages.
And be part of the day after.
And they will be part of the day after as well. They will continue on governing Gaza once Israel pulls out. So really, what they're looking for is the ultimate success. We can murder hundreds of Jews, 1,200 people. We can take hostages. We can release all of the terrorists, and we can force Israel to its knees and live to tell the story the next day.
And one other thing,
that's their demand.
They also don't have to be careful in terms of keeping all the hostages alive, because the deal that they're going to ask for, you mentioned the number 139. And if it's not 139, if it's only 120, and if it's not 120, if it's only 100, the deal that they will demand will be the same deal. And that's also part of the psychological warfare, because when they release a tape showing hostages alive, and we heard the interview between Thomas Hand and Piers Morgan, where he mentioned that his daughter was with one of the hostages, and he was alive and well, and now it's announced that he's not. So obviously, they were probably murdered.
There have been a number of the hostages who Israel has already announced. Not the terrorists, has announced that we believe that they are no longer alive because of whatever information we had. So that's already terror.
Remember in the old days of hijackings of airplanes, terrorists used to threaten that every hour we're going to kill another hostage, and that used to wait. So Hamas is not doing it in that manner. What Hamas is doing,
I think not yet.
Well, they're doing it, but they're not doing it announcing that they're doing it. So when they show a tape of someone alive, and then they show another tape of the people dead. The effect that it has on the families is, will my loved one be next? Who is it? And that's why you hear among the families that time is running out. They have to be released now, or bring them home now. And that's the pressure that the decision makers are in, this very it's a no-win situation.
It's a no-win
in terms of what to do and where they do. Now, the one thing that I do want to mention is that for the families, their world are the hostages that are there now. And that's what they focus on, and that's what we hear. And the empathy that we have as a viewing public and as a public that's sympathetic to their needs is on that. The decision makers have that within their ball game, but they also have everything else. They also have the future. They also have the present. They also have how this is going to affect Judea and Samaria, how this is going to affect return to Gaza communities. So all that is part of the general decision-making process that they'd have to make. And the hard question is, what is the right thing to do and what is the best thing to do? And it goes back to the first question that I asked: are the goals of destroying Hamas completely and getting all the hostages back home safely, are they still compatible?
I mean, I would imagine that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is also taking into account that one of his decisions was probably one of the critical elements of the October 7th massacre, the Gilad Shalit deal, releasing the soldier who had been kidnapped in 2006. He spent 5 years in captivity and was released in 2011. But as part of the attack, we saw key figures, including Yahya Sinwar, the now head of Hamas, who really drove, planned, executed this whole massacre, was released as part of that deal. Other people, Ali Khadi, who were small-time murderers, terrorist murderers before, now big company commanders, actively involved in all of these attacks. And you see so many of these people who were released then active in the October 7 massacre, whether it be planning or executing as well. And so I would imagine that also for Prime Minister Netanyahu, that's sitting on his head all the time. Up to, I think, October 6th, I think that there had already been 12 people at least murdered by terrorists who were released as part of the Shalit deal. I follow them closely, both previously as head of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria. I sent some of them back to prison, but in many cases we're seeing that those people are involved. So that must be even a thought for Prime Minister Netanyahu. How do you put those two goals together? We want to get all of the hostages released, but really with that little asterisk that if I look forward, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm causing more damage. For example, as you mentioned before, if we now release all of the hostages for all of the terrorists, so there are hundreds of murderers, hundreds of terrorists who have been released or have been arrested, or are in prison or have been convicted of terrorist attacks that come from Judea and Samaria. If we release them now, then we're starting this next war. Marwan Barghouti, the head of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, who the terrorists are again active and murdering people. Abdallah Barghouti, who at the moment is the record holder of 67 consecutive life sentences for murdering people. I happened to be around when he was sentenced, and he said, I confess to all of this. I'm proud of what I did, and if you just give me the chance, he said, he's a member of Hamas, I will kill more people.
Look,
and this is who they're expecting us to release.
In the ideal situation, we could say, well, these are lives that we could save now. Let's get them home now, and let's worry about how we're going to take care of these terrorists in the future. That's the ideal situation. But as you pointed out, it's never happened and it's never worked out before.
Yeah, we never did that.
It's more like there's going to be a price to pay. There's going to be a price to pay now, and there's going to be a price to pay later. The question is, which one are we looking for? And it sort of like reminds me of this old advert on TV that was many years ago in the States. You see this mechanic working on a car in his garage, and he's saying, this guy came in, and He's now has to do a $500 job on his engine because his engine broke down. You know why it broke down? And he picks up this oil filter. He says, because he wouldn't invest $4 in this oil filter when he could have. So he says, you could pay me now or you could pay me later. And that's essentially the situation that we're in now. We have a situation now that we know there's going to be a price to pay if we give into Hamas's demands now. The question is, are we willing to pay that price? And that's the horrible psychological pressure that the families are under. That's the horrible psychological pressure that the government is under. And that's what Hamas is playing very expertly from their holes.
I just want to make sure that I understood that. Also, the analogy, what I had between 1998 and 2016, when I left the IDF, I had the unfortunate role of being involved in not a small amount of these negotiations of the decisions to release terrorists for whatever reason it was. Sometimes it was to receive the bodies of Israeli soldiers and Israelis who had been arrested by or abducted by Hezbollah. Sometimes it was just as a show of a gesture of goodwill to Mahmoud Abbas, and we had that as well. Hundreds of people who were released, and every single one of these events really undermined more and more and more of Israel's deterrence. And the Palestinians, as of again before the war, had celebrated 40 different different instances in which Israel had released thousands of terrorists, and they'd learned that, well, this works. It works. If we kidnap one person, we're going to be able to get a massive payoff. They were willing to release even 100 of the hostages because they had another 139 more. And so that payment that we're giving them all the time. In
psychological terms, we call this reinforcement.
We've reinforced that child having a tantrum.
Right. It's exactly what it is. You know, there's another element that we didn't discuss that's also very important to bring up here. Besides the hostage families, we have the families of IDF soldiers that are now fighting, IDF soldiers that have been wounded, and IDF soldiers that unfortunately have fallen in battle. What do we tell these people? What do we tell
them if we stop now and we don't achieve that goal of destroying Hamas?
Now, what do you tell them? And that again is part of the balance that any government and any leader has to take a look at. On this side, you have that, and you have the situation where you have people who have hostage families that also have family that are fighting in the war. So these are the horrible dilemmas that we're put into by this situation. And when you mentioned, this is what terrorists do. This is not something this is not a state actor we can negotiate with. This is not somebody that we could bring in front of an impartial tribunal and try to have some sort of compromise with. These are people for whom there's no rules. There's no right and no wrong. They'll do whatever they have to do. They'll break any deal. That's the other thing. If you make a deal with them, how do we know we're going to keep the deal? That's the other situation.
So today, one of these major events that's ostensibly happening today is that with the help, ostensibly again of Qatar, medicine and medical
how's that worked out?
is apparently being taken into Gaza today for the hostages.
We have no way of knowing.
We have no way of knowing where that's going, right? No way of knowing whether it's actually going to the hostages. That's the same part of the psychological warfare.
And it's a psychological reward for Hamas. They were able to say, look, we allowed medicine in. Now, whether or not that ever gets anywhere, and I think is good reason to suspect that it won't get anywhere, is another question. But they've already gained their international respectability to some degree. As horrible as it was, they've shown that they've allowed some humanity into their lives, but that's another part of the game.
I think it has to be understood also that Hamas isn't an irrational actor. Hamas saw the initial branding of the equivalency between Hamas and ISIS, and they understood that was something which didn't help their cause. Possibly is that why we haven't seen these videos running around of beheadings of the hostages, and possibly we won't see them at all
We've seen
because
dead hostages.
Hamas.
We've seen dead hostages, but we haven't seen how they became dead.
Yeah, I mean that's a
And
big difference.
and in fact, Hamas is denying any culpability in that. What they're
They're saying
saying
that
is the
Israel-
IDF has done it. And which shows you, which speaks to your point of their sensitivity of being, put in as ISIS. So they are still trying to maintain that sort of veil of respectability to some degree for the Western world. For their own people, that's a different story. That becomes totally irrelevant. Their success and their glory of October 7th will live on. And that's really what we need also to understand, to try and break that chain, which is why it's so important for Hamas really to lose the capability to rule and lose the capability to have any sort of military effect from this point on.
And to at all function afterwards, because that would be any type of Hamas survival of the war would be seen as a victory for them, no matter what it is, no matter how small it is. Even just that little ability to control a small area in Gaza will be seen and presented to them as a victory. And because, as you mentioned before, of this very wide popular support amongst the Palestinian people themselves in Gaza, in Judea and Samaria, for Hamas, for the massacre, any type of remaining presence would really allow them to regroup, rebuild, and to regrow their mechanisms.
And it's important to get this point across. And one of the things we spoke about is how important the media and communication is in this. And this is a message that media sources, both in Israel and both outside of Israel, really need to incorporate in their understanding of objective reporting. That this is how a terrorist organization works, this is what they're trying to get to, and this is what they want the day after. So as much as we could bang that message home and continue to bring it to people's attention, it really is important in terms of shaping the public reaction to what's happening.
So what we've seen so far among the families of the hostages, I think, is possibly two different. I would imagine there's more, but very clear camps. Maybe one camp saying, you know what, we need to do everything in order to bring about the immediate release of the hostages. That's what we're seeing also from many of the hostages who have been released. That call of saying, I don't think you understand the desperate situation of hostages, and therefore you have to do everything to release them. And then on the other hand, you've got other families who have said, we understand that difficulty, and nonetheless, we understand that Israel cannot do everything possible in order to bring about the release of the hostages. How do those families? How do you think those families are going to develop through the situation as day 103 becomes day 110 and day, God forbid, and day 150, and we get to the situation where we're a year into the war and the hostages are still being held there, and really there's very little change expected.
The common denominator that we had, and the question is, do we still have it, is the belief that continued military pressure will assist in releasing the hostages. So there was a turning point that unfortunately went the wrong way with the hostages that were erroneously friendly fire killed by us a few weeks ago. Had that turned out differently, we would be in a different place today, because that would have been proof that military pressure does release hostages and bring some back alive. And that was a complete downer for the Israeli public. That could have been a complete game changer as far as we have now. But that's
on the other hand, we saw that the first few weeks, the first even month of the military operation in Gaza did force Hamas into a situation where they released 100 of the hostages and 100 plus, because they were all the foreigners, and they got the 5 days, continue on for 6 days of a halt in the military operations. That's something which again I possibly could be tolerated, but not a complete end to the war itself. That's not something which I think most of Israeli society would tolerate.
Right, and that's part of the dilemma. because what we have portrayed, it's very difficult to open up the radio or open up the television and not see and watch for any period of time and not see a hostage family on their delivering their case, which we understand and it's there. The question is,
I mean, just for our audience watching, sorry to interrupt you, I have to give you a picture of what's going on in Israel at the moment. For those of you who haven't seen or haven't been here, we're talking about the pictures of the hostages that are all over the country. All over the country. When you go out of Ben Gurion through the airport, or when you come in, there are pictures of the hostages. In every mall, there are pictures of the hostages. On billboards, as you drive along the roads, there are pictures of the hostages. In every neighborhood, all around this awareness of the hostages and really of the fear for their safety is everywhere. It's something which is almost completely encompassing of Israeli society, and that's something that we're dealing with all the time. That pressure building up, and I can only imagine that it's just going to get worse and worse.
Well, one of the things that I think would have been better from the beginning is, instead of the slogan "Bring them home now," the slogan should have been "Release them now." And there's a subtle difference between the two, because I think the "Bring them home now" is something that allows pressure on our government to continue, and "Release them now" would be something that would allow pressure on other governments to make sure that the Red Cross does their job, that the Hamas becomes human beings, which is a fantasy. Yeah. But it contributes to the difficulty that you're mentioning, that it's all over the place, and it's very hard to make, which I guess is, in a way, it shows our humanity. It's very difficult to make any reasonable decision without taking the hostages into consideration as we should. And the question is, again, if the goals become incompatible, what happens at that point? As long as we say, and as long as it's accepted, and that's being questioned now within Israeli society and even within the cabinet, from reports that are coming out, is the goal of military pressure to destroy Hamas compatible with bringing home the hostages safely at this point?
Right.
And that's the question that really.
So I think that's really the common denominator between the subject of the money, of transferring money to the PA, and also the slogan of "Bring them home." It's, you put pressure on the organ that you think can be subject to your pressure and subject to your influence. The Americans would like to, the US administration would like to push the Israeli government to give in to the demands of Mahmoud Abbas, because there's no one to talk to there. He's literally a terrorist in a suit that's paying people financial rewards to murder Jews. And so go and try and have an intelligent, logical, moral conversation with him. There's no one to deal with. So the pressure then becomes onto the Israeli government. And the same, I think, for the families of the hostages. Firstly, they're Israeli citizens, so they look to their government to put on the pressure. And on the other hand, there's no one else to talk to. You mentioned the ICRC, the Red Cross. They are literally doing nothing. They have done nothing all the way through the process. They have, whilst Israel has continued to allow them to visit the hostage, the terrorists that we've arrested.
And the UN has done nothing.
They've done nothing. The UN has done absolutely nothing. The UN has facilitated exactly the opposite. The UN has pushed constantly. Every single one of their organizations has pushed for, well, what about the humanitarian needs of the Palestinians? Never once stopping and saying, well, there are humanitarian needs of the Jews as well.
And it's not only Jews there.
And it's not only Jews there. Most of the foreigners have actually been released, apart from the Drusim and some of the Israeli Arabs as well. You're right, they're part of that equation. But unfortunately, and as bad as this may sound, I don't think the UN gives a damn about Jewish lives and about Israeli citizens' lives. I don't care whether you're an Israeli Arab or not. They don't care, because you're in that whole spectrum of the Jewish country. So that's really, and that's really what they've been doing all the way along. I saw today UNRWA is again harping on about the humanitarian situation, that it's the worst situation. They don't say anything about the 150,000 Israelis internally who have been displaced.
Right.
They say nothing about the hostages. UNRWA has been completely ineffectual about bringing any type of information, help, assistance to the Israeli hostages, and yet
Well, you have a lot of
they
Hamas
only
people
see
on
one-
their payroll, so that's the other thing.
exactly that. They see only one side because Hamas and UNRWA basically go together. And so you see nothing of any of these organizations. So I can understand the feelings of the families where they look to the only
And
possible
the frustration is
body that
palpable.
can help them.
The frustration is palpable. And here's where there's a danger, because we all talk about not wanting to go back to the divisiveness that we had on October 6th and before.
Yeah.
And the longer this stretches on, and the longer that this dilemma between continuing and releasing, the more that there's going to be divisiveness created. And if there's one message that you hear from any of this, I mentioned that, we have the hostage families, then you have the soldiers that are fighting. If there's one thing you hear from the soldiers, and one thing you hear from the soldiers' families of soldiers that have fallen in battle, it's we can't go back to October 6th. And you hear from anyone that comes out of Gaza and the fighting, you hear them say, all this stuff that you see going on outside doesn't exist inside. When we're there, we all get together, we're fighting together, we have a common goal. And that really needs to be anchored into society. And that's really something that we need, that the media needs to be able to understand as well, that any of this divisiveness in terms of complaining, and some of the complaints are legitimate, but it really has to be handled in a way that we realize that this common goal of not breaking up, which is what Hamas wanted, what Hamas will nurture if they can, that we can't go back to that. And whatever is decided by the government and whatever is decided actions by hostage families, we all have to understand that everybody is coming from an area that they think that they're doing what's important for them. But we need to really to give support to the fighting force and support to whatever decisions are going to come out that are made with everybody in mind. And that's really the bottom line.
And it's tremendously difficult to even contemplate trying to put yourself in the position of these families where, on the one hand, all they want is their children to come home, their loved ones to come home. On the other hand, they know intellectually that that action, given the demands of Hamas, will inevitably cause the death of hundreds of more people, will allow them to show this sign of victory and allow them to enjoy the victory of surviving to the next day. How does someone in that situation
intellectually they
try and rationalize that?
They won't accept that. It's intellectually someone who's not in that situation understands that. When you're in that situation, you don't want to understand that because there's the old story of Geula Cohen, who was she's the mother of the current Tzachi Hanegbi. And there was some sort of hostage situation going on, and they asked her, Geula, what would you do if Tzachi was the one that was kidnapped and there was a hostage? She said, as a mother, I would be screaming outside the prime minister's office every day, release him, do what you have to do, release him. But as a government official, I would tell the prime minister, ignore that woman outside who's screaming at you.
Yeah.
And that is back into the dilemma.
It's that dual role.
This is a Solomonic situation. It's difficult. We could only understand the horrors that the families are going through, and we could understand that the pressures that the government and the ministers are going through, because it's the same sort of situation of a dilemma, not knowing where to go. So when you say they intellectually understand that this is something, intellectually perhaps, but emotionally, you have a heart and you have a brain. And sometimes your heart tells you to do one thing and your brain tells you to do another. For the hostage families, their hearts are really the key in terms of where they're going and what they're doing. And their intellectual aspect of what you mentioned is really being pushed to the side as they see they could touch their families, knowing that if this is done, they'll be able to get them back. And that's really how I wouldn't use the word rationalize, that's how they deal and cope with it.
Yeah. I mean, that same situation that you described with Gula Khan is really, today it's actually happening. We have Eliyahu Liebman.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen for our audience. Eliyahu Liebman is a head of a local municipality council. One of his sons was kidnapped on the 7th of October. Another one of his sons is now fighting in Gaza. And is leaving messages all over with a graffiti. If you see my brother, tell him that I'm looking for him. And to hear Eliyahu Liebman speak and talk and say, well, this is where I want to go. This is what I want to see. This is what I expect. It's really an unbelievable situation to be in.
But he is not echoing what most of the hostage families are saying.
No, he's not. He is not echoing those demands for an immediate
now under all conditions
ceasefire under all conditions. It's something which he really has been, I think, very cautious in his demands and
very
really,
responsible.
As we all say, as a parent, I had an interview on South African radio a few weeks ago about this ridiculous claim of the genocide, and the interviewer, who was quite hostile, I have to say, said, "Well, as a father, what?" So we're all fathers as well, so parents as well. We can put ourselves in that situation, or even try and think that we can put ourselves in that situation, but I think it's very difficult to do that in any way, shape, or form. But one of the other experts that we had on the War Room Briefing was someone who really has written the code for dealing with trauma, immediate trauma, how to get people back functioning, giving them even tasks. Do this, do that, re-empowering someone who's in that situation of trauma. Does that last? Does that carry on for long term and have long-term effects, or is it something which you just can't humanly expect people to do that, to just go about their daily task and push that trauma aside?
Well, that's it's the old dilemma in dealing in psychiatric work in terms of depression. One of the things that we know about depression is that if you go run and you're active, your depression goes away. The problem is, when you're depressed, you don't feel like going outside and running. So that's exactly what the issue is. So if people do keep active and people do things, of course the trauma is not there because they are involved in other activities. The question is, how do you get people to get there? And
how do you
continue?
How do you get the country functioning back?
Well, we haven't really hit. We're
we're still in that trauma, deeply in that trauma.
We're in pre-trauma. We haven't gotten to post-trauma yet. We're in pre-trauma because we don't even know what's waiting for us. People say you don't know what's waiting for us around the corner. We don't know what's waiting for us until we get to the corner.
Right.
So that's part of the situation. There's so many unknowns here. We don't know what's going to happen in Gaza. We don't know what's going to happen in the north. We don't know what's going to happen with Saudi Arabia. We don't know what's going to happen with the Houthis. We don't know how the American election is going to affect anything, how the campaigning is going to affect. There's so many we don't knows. A year from now, we're going to be in a completely different situation where we're going to look back, and some of us will say, well, how didn't we see this and how didn't we see that?
In the week, just as a reminder, in the week leading up to the October 7 massacre, what Israel's government was discussing was the ability or the possibility to broaden the permits that were given to Gazans to come into Israel, raising it from 17,000 to 20,000, letting more people in, feeding more the Gazan economy, as if that was part of the deterrent. And
that's a real problem today with Judea and Samaria. This is a problem that's being discussed now. What is going to happen with all the 120,000 Palestinian workers that are not legally,
which is a major part of
permits
of their economy?
What's going to happen? Do we allow them in? Do we not allow them in? And that's another.
When you take into account that 82% of them, according to the internal Palestinian survey, support the October 7 massacre and support Hamas. So when you let these people in, of those 120,000, you've got just very, very quick math. If we could do it, like almost 90,000 people plus coming into Israel who statistically actually support the October 7 massacre. So
Or what happened
what
a
do you
few
do
days
with
ago in my hometown of Ranana. Two people working in a car wash decided to
Yeah.
steal a car and go out and go on a rampage and killed one woman and seriously injured a lot of others and children
which
waiting at
could
a
have
bus stop.
ended
So,
really very badly.
right, and these are just workers. They just there to work. So how do you filter? How do you know who's that and who's that? That's part of the dilemma, and it's a real issue in terms of what we're going to do. So these are all you talk about the psychological aspects, the cognitive aspects of what people have to consider and people have to think. But I'll go back to the same thing. It's the importance of having a unified society, of having resilience within society. You can't have we talk about in Hebrew, use the word chosen. That's really resilience. If the society is resilient, then the work effort can go on. People can go on. But in order for resilience to be something we could expect within the Israeli public, we need to have a unified leadership. Because without that, then everybody goes into their own parts. And
what's amazing that we're seeing now in Israel, I think on all fronts is a disparity between our political leadership and the people on the street. I think there's tremendous unity on the street. I think all of that divisiveness of the 6th of October has to a great extent been thrown aside, and people who were very very active on either side of the spectrum are now fighting together, living together, acting together, and that's been put aside. I hope that our political leadership will be able to find that same unity, which we're seeing sometimes more and sometimes a little bit less. And it's something which I think is going to continue on with us for a very long time. This is one of those subjects which I think that we could really go on for hours discussing, but unfortunately our time has come to an end. This, ladies and gentlemen, it's part of the dilemma that we're going through. It's part of terrorism. It's that inherent part of terrorism that you use violent actions in order to force a government or another group of people to really take a decision that is against their best interest. And here we have a genocidal terrorist organization that's really using human beings, that's using babies, women, children, the elderly, everyone as really leverage against Israeli society, to cause Israel's government to surrender to their demands and to allow these terrorists to see another day. And let's be clear about it. They're not living to see another day just to enjoy a better financial future. They're living to see another day so that they can again prepare themselves, ready themselves, and arm themselves to again try and massacre Jews. That's Hamas's charter. It hasn't changed ever. Said in 1988, it calls for the active murder of Jews and the liberation of all of what they see as Palestine. It isn't just about a little bit of territory which you can give them and placate them. They want everything, and they will stop at nothing until they receive their goal. That's unfortunate, the reality, and that will carry us forward for a long time. This is our last program for this week. Obviously Thursday there's no program. Tomorrow Shabbat still early in Israel, so we will see you again next week on Sunday at 4 o'clock Israel time, 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, please continue logging on. For those of you who want to, you can also join us via the JCPA YouTube channel. You can find the icon on the JCPA's website at the top, and there you can join us live for all of these war room briefings. In the meantime, stay safe, everyone, and we will see you again on Sunday Goodbye and good evening. Thank you, afternoon, and thank you,
From
Owen,
Jerusalem.
for joining us in Jerusalem. And you're welcome to come and join us as well in Jerusalem anytime.